Hello, patrons. We love you. Thank you so much for your support. We have, at least I have, a couple of fun stories for this week's Patreon exclusive.
You always do, my friend. You always do.
Well, before we get into the main thing I want to talk, I actually want to incorporate a little college football here because there was some poetry this last weekend that I think is one of those things when you think of sports and movies, and sometimes things happen in a way that, it's like scripts write themselves in real life sometimes.
Yeah. It's like the story is right there.
It's right there. Now, this isn't necessarily like a full feature kind of script that wrote itself in real life, but it was poetic in the same vein.
Okay.
So I'm watching Michigan play UNLV on Saturday, right?
Yeah.
Michigan's quarterback is a kid by the name of J.J. McCarthy. Okay, highly touted recruit, very good quarterback.
Oh, yeah.
One of his best friends from high school committed to play at UNLV.
Okay.
And so it was kind of interesting that UNLV was on the schedule this year. They were going to come to the big house, and JJ and his family, they were going to get together with his friend and his family. They were going to have a whole weekend of it.
Mm-hmm.
However, unfortunately, his friend passed away back in February.
Oh.
And so that obviously didn't come to fruition. So during the game on Saturday, JJ wrote the number 47 on his hand.
Okay.
47, being the number of his friend who passed away.
Right.
So he has 47 on his hand. And it's interesting because initially I didn't know this. My brother and I recognized it, and we tried to decipher it, and we were thinking like 47, what would that be? I don't know.
Wow.
I really had no idea. And then the third quarter comes, and Michigan is on offense, so JJ is on the field.
Mm-hmm.
And the broadcast, which was CBS, they took a moment where, there was a little pause. There wasn't a ton of action happening at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
So this was when we're going to talk about 47 and JJ. So they get a nice little close-up of 47 on his hand. They tell us the story of them being in high school. They're really close. They're really tight friends.
Yeah.
They were supposed to have this weekend together. Unfortunately, it doesn't happen because he passes away. So in his honor, he writes 47 on his hand.
Yeah.
And it's this beautiful little moment, this touching story. And Brennan, this is, you can't make this up. You just can't make this up.
I'm just waiting for the hashtag JD Tears portion of this story to come out.
We're at it. We're at it. And it's so fascinating how life works sometimes. Like, life's ironies never cease to amaze me. And you can go back and watch the broadcast, because I promise you this is not hyperbole. Like, the way I'm laying this out is exactly how it happened. So
right.
Michigan is moving the ball. They're on offense. CBS does the story. 47, honoring him, touching moment. The very next play, JJ throws a 47-yard touchdown pass.
Yeah, that's like that's the climactic battle right there.
It was unbelievable. And Brad Nessler, longtime play-by-play announcer for football.
Yeah.
And has done CBS the last few years.
Someone who has arguably seen
retired.
Everything.
Yeah. Brad Nessler has seen everything. He's been around for decades.
Yeah.
Decades doing play-by-play.
Yeah.
When he realizes that it was a 47-yard touchdown pass, you can hear him choke up. Like, he gets emotional himself. He's the one that has the hashtag JD Tears. It's like, oh my gosh. And then even his color commentary was like, yeah, it's just a breathtaking moment. It just takes your breath away, I think was the exact words.
I feel like this is arguably the college football moment of the weekend. I feel like most people will be talking about how Texas beat Bama, and I'm sure our friend Ryan McQuaid will be highlighting that
Yeah.
specific event over the weekend, and rightfully so. That was a nice victory on Texas's part.
Mhm.
But this moment in particular that you're referencing, I think, is
It's
quite
unreal.
astounding. And this,
Yeah.
this is coming from a Penn State fan. I
Uh-huh.
barely even watch my game. It's an important game when they only air it on Peacock, which was the Penn State game
That was
against
Michigan
Delaware.
last week. Yeah. Yeah.
But what you're
Exactly.
talking about there, that is certainly the moment of the weekend, if you ask
It
me.
was unbelievable. Like, and it's just, it's one of those, like, sports is incredible for a lot of reasons, but it
Yeah.
is fascinating how stuff like that tends to happen more often than you would think. And yeah, it was just this beautiful moment of spiritual poetry. Like it was just unbelievable how they went right from that story to the next play, a
Yeah.
47-yard touchdown. Like how do those two things
It's
just happen to
almost
coalesce at the right moment?
it's spiritual.
It's
Spiritual. Yeah.
truly incredible. Like again, it's the stuff of movies, the stuff of scripts that we see all the time. And sometimes I think we forget, like you watch those and you're like, oh, that only happens in the movies. But it actually happens in real life a lot.
It just doesn't
as
happen
well.
that often, so it's easier to criticize a movie when they do that
Yeah.
trope more often. But
Pretty
I don't know, there
incredible.
is some validity in those
Yeah.
moments. Every sports game will eventually have its Rocky moment. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
absolutely.
And look, the clip is all over Twitter. So if you just
Yeah.
simply search JJ McCarthy 47, you'll find it quite easily. And again, you don't have to be a fan of Michigan or anything like that. Like it's just
Mhm.
watch the clip. It is so moving and incredible. Like it'll give you chills. Like it
It's
just
awesome.
it happened so majestically that it gives you chills. Like you transcended to a different universe or something. It's unreal how it happened.
What was the sequel to Angels in the Outfield? Angels in the End Zone, I think it was.
That's pretty much that's exactly how it felt. It was unreal.
That's great. I'm so glad you have that story in support of your own team. It makes it even better.
Yeah.
For
Oh,
sure.
it certainly makes it more personal that it's
Yeah.
Michigan, but I would find that fascinating
Oh
regardless.
yeah,
But
absolutely.
at any rate, moving on to the main thing I want to discuss here. And again, I will apologize up front because Brendan and I have talked about this a lot over the last month or so. However, I did want to bring it up here once again because it is the ending of a journey, and so this will be the last time that we
Our
can talk
film
about it here.
listeners, our active film patrons are probably thinking, "Oh, thank God they can finally stop talking about the Harry Potter books."
We will after this. I promise. I promise. Of course, if you follow me on social media, I did post about this, so you
Yeah, you did.
certainly know where I'm going here. But yeah, I finally finished Deathly Hallows, the book, and I loved it. I
Okay.
absolutely loved it. There's a lot to the book. And really, a lot of it follows, or the movie, excuse me, follows the book pretty well. Obviously, the
Yeah.
book expands on a lot of these scenes and expands on the nuances and details that the movie just can't. It doesn't have time to, even in two parts, doesn't have time to get into everything.
Right.
And some of the changes they do make, I think, are apt and small. And I think it's a really great adaptation. I mean, mostly you feel the differences in part one. I feel like part two follows the ending of the book
Yeah.
rather closely.
There are a few small things in part two, the movie, that change things a little bit that I did prefer. And it's not so much
Fair.
the plot; it's more so the intimacy that movie was going for. Like, I guess,
Yeah.
for instance, the actual final climactic battle between Harry and Voldemort in the movie, it's just between the two of them. But in the book,
it's in
you've
front
got
of a whole bunch
literally
of
everyone.
people.
And
Yeah.
honestly, when I was reading we might disagree on this, but when I was reading the book initially, even before seeing the movie, because it predated the movie, my first thought was, oh, this is just corny. This just does not work for me. And I kind of preferred the almost like the sense of isolation that the movie was providing.
Yeah, and that's very fair. I feel like up until that moment, though, everything from the book and the movie is pretty much the same, or at least the spirit
I,
is
I
very
would
much
say
there.
of the three, if we're calling him three, part one and part two, Deathly Hallows specifically, of the three adaptations that David Yates directed, I would say this one, Deathly Hallows, is certainly the most faithful as an adaptation, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I don't say that as a bad thing. I
No.
really like Deathly Hallows Part 2. I, like you, prefer a lot of the character building and this, the building up
Yeah.
of everything we see in Part 1. I do prefer that, but everything in Part 2 I do really like. And with the book just collectively as one story, I love that the emotion that the films evoke is very much there. And maybe even more so because, again, the book is able to expand in areas that the film simply cannot. For example, Mrs. Weasley in the book, one of my faves. I loved her in the book. And we're able to expand upon her more. Like, she is ultimately one of the things that is cut from the movie because it's not really her story. The
It
Weasleys
isn't-
in general, like, because there's everything with, what is the older brother's name? Percival or something like that?
I think it's is
Percy?
it Percy? I think it's Percy.
Yeah. Okay. So, like, he is pretty much cut out of the movies altogether. But is a big
Oh,
part.
no. Are we talking about the one played by Donald Gleason?
No, I'm talking about the oldest one that is
Oh,
in the
right,
ministry.
right.
Because like in books 4 and 5 and 6, like, he is completely separated from his family. They do not see politically eye to eye together. Like, he is distancing himself from them altogether, and just doesn't want to be a part of the Weasley family anymore. Like, he is full on ministry. But
subtly hinted at in the fifth movie, though. Remember when he?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it is hinted at in the movie. You're right. So they do, like, it's there, I guess, lingering in the background of the movies, but the movies just simply don't have time to really indulge in that specific drama. But in the books, there are moments where Mr. and Mrs. Weasley, like, we do see them wrestle directly with their heartbrokenness over the fact that their son is distancing himself as part of the ministry. Like, they don't, but at the same time, they don't let that, I guess it doesn't restrict them from being who they are and what they believe. Which obviously the rest of the family follows them.
It doesn't break the family apart, at least those who still exist.
Absolutely.
And hold to their beliefs together.
Absolutely. And there are just times, especially with Mrs. Weasley, whenever he's brought up, like, you just get a sense of, like, her desperation. Like, she still loves him even though she doesn't agree with his worldview. And so, like, I love how JK is able to build on that. So when we get to Deathly Hallows, the book, and it's the big fight, and then he finally realizes his mistake, and he comes back and apologizes, and she just begins to sob and just embraces him.
Yeah.
I wept.
It's interesting.
I just loved it.
It's interesting you bring up Molly Weasley because I remember when the movie was coming out, Deathly Hallows Part 2, I think there was some, I forget where the source was, but I think there was some like poll or tally out there that received like thousands of votes asking book fans, what is the one thing from the book you most want to see in the movie? And overwhelmingly, the thing everyone asked for was Mrs. Weasley going, "Not my daughter, you bitch." That was the thing everyone wanted to see.
Which we do get in the movie. So, like,
do,
at least, they have to somewhat pick and choose. And I get it because Ginny.
Close.
Close. She is in the movies and has a significant role. So choosing that makes sense. And it's just as satisfying in the book as it is in the movie. I certainly get that. But yeah, that moment with her eldest, which again, I understand why they had to remove it from the movie, but in the book, that was equally as rewarding and emotionally very potent. And I love all of that. And of course, there's more to Fred's death. And that's another thing that's emotionally invigorating about the book is not only does the eldest son come back and they have this incredible moment of reconnection, but when Fred is killed, it's the oldest son that doesn't want to leave the body. Everyone else is like, it's sad, it sucks, but he's dead. We have to move on because there's all this death and carnage happening. Like the battle is still very on. And he's like, no, I'm not leaving. And so it's this incredible moment of redemption for him.
That's why, the death of Fred Weasley, right? I believe it was Fred or George. It was one of the two.
I think it was Fred.
Yeah, we'll say Fred. It was one of the twins. Of all of the deaths in the book, that was the one that affected me the most. I think overall, one of the things I do prefer about the movie is the way it handles the killing off of some of your beloved characters, because there's something kind of like fleeting about it, as if like their ghosts still linger throughout the movie, even though you didn't give them a proper goodbye. And that just somehow adds to the pain. In the book, I will admit, one of my things I remember not loving about it was that I felt like at times I was just page turning until I get to the next death. Because it's at times it got kind of like dense with the amount of death and carnage we were getting, that almost like J.K. Rowling was kind of relishing in it. But there are times that, like with Fred Weasley, that I think she finds a new avenue with it, where it gets way more compelling and way more emotionally stirring.
And this could be the side effect of me doing this exercise after seeing the films.
In reverse, yeah. Or it's also the fact that I read these books only once when they first came out, and I was a little, more cynical at that age. So I was definitely latching on to more of the predictability. There was a good chance I was probably going to be disappointed by that final book at that time, regardless of how good it turned out. So I'm willing to admit that if I said I didn't like the book that much, that's coming from, minus 20 years from me right now. That's coming from 12, 13-year-old Brendan, I guess. So take that with a grain of salt.
That's understandable. And I'm coming in this at a very different age, obviously, looking at the world in a different prism, and of course seeing the movie. So as I'm going through the book, I can follow the book through the prism of the movie as well. So I know how to envision what's happening as, what's there on the page. And then also even things that aren't in the movie, just because I know who's playing these characters in the film, I can envision those actors doing these things as I'm reading the book as well. So in a lot of ways, I can't separate the two. I do think the performances and the magic of the movie and what JK is writing on the page, the two of them do kind of merge for this magical journey, pun intended. And I think that's why I've enjoyed all of these books to some degree or another.
You bring up
about the two art forms colliding here.
You bring up an interesting point for those of us who are movie critics, and when we see the movies first and then want to go back and read the source material, we have almost like half the work done for us, right? Because when you read a book for the first time, part of the fun is, kind of imagining the world yourself.
And all of it.
Yeah, but when that work, but when that work is done, does that make a book better or worse? I think
it could be a little bit both. But
it could be a little bit both. It could depend.
For me, it was enjoyable. Like every time I saw Harry or Hermione and Ron, like I envisioned the actors, or Snape, which I'm going to get to in a moment. I can't really separate the actors and the characters. And it's interesting because even as I was going through the books and there was a name that I didn't put a face to, one of the first things I would do is go to IMDb and look at the character and see what the actor was. And then it would all flood back to me as to who was portraying what the character was. And then I was able to just kind of see those faces and them speak these different roles. And it just made the exercise for me all the more satisfying. And that's probably why I enjoyed all of these books to one degree or another. But, especially Deathly Hallows, I like, to me, the emotion that's of the film is very much there on the page. Maybe even more so because there's just more there than what the film is able to get into. But
I have a final question about the books, but I feel like you need to get a little bit into Snape and get a little cathartic for a moment. So I'll let you have the floor before I ask this final question, because I think the question I want to ask is a good final question for this conversation.
Okay, so Severus Snape, after going through all of the books and obviously seeing the films, I can say fervently that he is one of my very favorite fictional characters of all time.
That's awesome to hear.
That's how high I am on this character. Top three.
I sometimes
Top
wonder.
three for me.
I sometimes wonder how he wasn't nominated for an Oscar for that final movie. And
I
it's
don't know.
not to say that he should have been when compared to other best supporting performances from that given year in 2011, I think that was. But the Academy loves to do this, right? They love to award or at least recognize career achievements, right? And I
Yeah.
feel like in many ways, Alan Rickman's work in that franchise is kind of the most career achievementable, if that makes
Sure.
sense.
Yeah.
And I could have seen
Yeah.
that happening.
I mean, just in terms of performance, and this couples to the writing as well, the screenplay adaptations, but also J.K. herself.
Sure.
What I love about Rickman's performance is that simultaneously he taps into this antagonism toward Harry that is incessantly there.
Yeah.
However, at times he's able to show this empathy rather,
Mhm.
that is a little mysterious, that is unveiled obviously in the final scenes of Deathly Hallows Part 2. So when you watch it in context, it just adds more layers to the performance.
Right.
And so there's this incredible maneuvering he's doing in terms of mystery and antagonism. And somehow in all of that, in the sarcasm, it's also really funny. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know how he's able to thread that needle, but he does. And one of my favorite moments where all of this coalesces is in Half-Blood Prince, where, and this is right after this significant moment, right, where they're walking
Yeah.
back from Hogsmeade,
Yeah.
and this book that was cursed almost kills this girl,
Yeah.
and Harry is accusing Malfoy of cursing the book. And of course, Snape is like, that's a very serious accusation.
Yep.
How do you know this? And Harry just says, I just know.
Yep.
And the response, and I'm going to butcher it in terms of how he does it, but Alan Rickman's response to it as Snape is incredible because he just goes, you just, long pause.
Yeah. You just
No. And the way he says that is hysterical, yet dramatically it still fits the scene perfectly. So
For
like
sure.
in terms
For
of the antagonism and like it's just, I don't know how he does it, but I laugh, but I also feel the drama. Like it's all there. It's incredible. Incredible,
Well,
that performance.
I think that's why the performance is so great is that he doesn't oversell any part of that character. So that way, when you find out what Snape's motivations were the whole time, it beautifully recontextualizes everything that you saw prior to that.
Well,
if you would have oversold any component, then all of a sudden you start to think that might seem a little out of character. But he never does cross that line into one direction or the other as far as antagonism or empathy is concerned.
Absolutely. And ultimately, this is why Snape is my favorite. He's a great little antagonist early on when it's through the perspective of 11 and 12-year-olds.
Right.
And constantly throughout the books and the movies, that evolves. There is more complexity to it as Harry learns more about Snape and where he comes from. There's that moment with the two of them in Half-Blood Prince. Where there's more of a reveal there. Harry finds out more about his father and the Marauders and how they treated Snape, which in the books is really fascinating because
that's true. Yeah.
You know, the movies don't get into this, and I understand why they don't. But in the books, it is interesting because Harry does have a moment where he wrestles with Sirius and his father and how they treated Snape, and he does empathize with Severus.
Yeah,
he's like,
he does.
Why did my father treat him this way? And he has
Yeah.
to go talk to Lupin, I believe it was,
Mhm.
or yeah, it was Lupin.
I believe it was
yeah.
Lupin. I believe you're right.
Yeah, and Lupin's like, look, we were 15 years old. It was a different time. It doesn't excuse it. Like, I love that Lupin doesn't try to negotiate the situation to change Harry's perspective.
As if,
He does own that they treated Snape horribly, but he's like, we were 15. We were a-holes at that time.
Yep.
And so like, and there is something interesting about that because one of the fascinating revelations of the books is that Harry was an asshole. Like he is very prickly through a lot of especially Order of the Phoenix onward. Like as much as I love Harry,
Oh yeah,
And
you loved his sarcasm quite a bit.
I
I remember
love
that.
his
Yeah.
sarcasm. I love his bitterness throughout a lot of it. And given his dynamic with Voldemort, it certainly makes a lot of sense.
Uh-huh. For sure.
And it's such a big theme of 5, but I do love that they continue that trend into 6 and 7 as well. And given Harry's persona in the books, that is something he very much got from his father, not just his looks, but at times he can be a bit prickly as well. So, and I love that irony because
For sure.
Harry is a little naive to it, because he never really admits his own assholery.
No, he just kind of has
because
it.
again, he's 15, 16 years old. So that is an interesting parallel. That I
Asshole
do
is genetic after all. It's hereditary.
exactly.
Yeah.
Anyway, back to Snape. What I love about that relationship, it does evolve. And then you get this reveal in Deathly Hallows where we come to find out that Severus grew up in a home where his parents clearly were warring with each other. He was neglected, didn't have very many friends. Lily was the only one who cared genuinely. And even at Hogwarts, that was the person that he cared about the most. And even as he was getting into the wrong crowd, so to speak, Lily was always the one that he cared about the most. And when she started to date James, of course, that offered a little bit of heartbreak, but he always did care. And I do like how, because I've seen some pushback that, is it a little weird or a little unhealthy that he continued to love Lily even though she was married and with James? And I don't necessarily disagree that it was unhealthy, but I do see that as this fascinating flaw.
And it
makes
I think
sense
that's
to
very
me.
deliberate.
Absolutely. And I find that fascinating, especially in context. I think it is important to remember that he grew up with no one that cared about him.
Right.
And when they were at Hogwarts, I think it's fair to say that while he was eventually a part of the Death Eaters and he had quote unquote friends there, I think the book and the films and the performance of Rickman implies that he never really cared about anyone in that group, and they certainly didn't care about him in the same way that Lily did.
Right.
Like Lily was the only relationship that mattered to him, and it was taken away from him by his own bully. So yes, that's going to affect him, but that love never really dissipated. So I just love the complexity of that. You couple it with the way J.K. writes him in that regard. You couple it with Rickman's performance in the films, and then we get this final revelation. And I don't know if it's because of all of these complexities and the emotional charge, broadly speaking, but especially with this pensive sequence we get in Deathly Hallows, coupled with, as I'm going through all of this, I am sitting there with my youngest, and your kids will always make you emotionally vulnerable. So
That's true.
It certainly could have been all of these things working against me. I don't know. But I'm going through this Deathly Hallows, and we get to that pensive moment, and we're getting more of the reveal. And again, what's fascinating about the book versus the movie is that there are more scenes in the book, and they're a little bit more extensive, where in the film they have to cut some of the sequence or some of the scenes that Harry goes through, and they're a little bit more condensed. So I do like that we get more of Severus with his childhood, that relationship with Lily and how deeply connected they were, which if I was to criticize the film, maybe you could say that was perhaps a little bit rushed, but
maybe a little bit.
But in the book, I think they do a really good job of demonstrating that they were really good childhood friends, and at Hogwarts, especially those first few years, they were still really good friends despite being in different houses. And it's not until Snape had a moment of weakness and he calls her a mudblood. That's really where that relationship was severed, or at least heavily damaged.
Oh, no wonder his name is Severus.
Severus.
He severed us.
And so, and that's a moment that's not in the film. Like they just kind of skip over that, which again, for time, I understand because the films wanted to emphasize and focus on that emotionality. And so they pick the scenes that really have that spiritual undertone the most. But
And you have Alan Rickman, who's so good of an actor that he can kind of find the hidden meaning in those things without the script having to spell it out as much. So sometimes you can kind of sense
that's
those
true.
things.
Well, and I guess in some ways, like where the film kind of, I guess makes up for that is in those visual cues we get of Rickman as Severus holding Lily's dead body there, or just him at the house. And obviously the scenes that we get between Severus and Dumbledore, which is all really great. And this is, I guess the moment of, this epiphanal moment that I have when going through the book, this moment of catharsis, what really struck home for me the most. And this is what I love so much about subtlety, because there is a slight difference between the book and the movie in this pensive scene that I love so much. And I think it's the thing that took me from this emotion that was starting to well to just complete and utter catharsis.
Okay.
So in the movie, I'm gonna go to the movie first.
Yeah.
So in the movie, Dumbledore starts telling Severus, okay, Harry's gonna have to die.
Yep.
And Severus somewhat pushes back, like, oh my gosh, I thought you cared about this kid, but really he's just been a lamb for the slaughter this whole time.
Mm-hmm.
And Dumbledore says, well, don't tell me you've come to care for him.
Yeah.
And God, this is so good. Just the way you get Rickman doing the Patronus.
Yeah.
And the way he says it, like that alone, I think adds some great emotionality to it. And you see the doe.
Yeah.
And as the doe jumps out the window, there's a cut to Dumbledore who says, Lily? After all this time, to the cut back to Snape who says, always. Okay. That context is important because in the book, when he does the Patronus, Dumbledore does not say the name Lily.
Right.
So in the book, it plays out like this. Dumbledore says, don't tell me that after all these years you've come to care for the boy. Expecto Patronum. Doe flies out the window. Dumbledore looks back at Severus, who is streaming tears. And then he says, always. That I love because it offers incredible ambiguity that the film does not really offer. When Dumbledore says Lily, it removes the ambiguity and immediately implies that what he is talking about there is strictly just Lily.
Yeah.
In the book, he does the Patronus, and then it comes to tears, and then he says always, which means that the answer to the question, after all these years that you've come to care for the boy,
the answer is yes.
The answer is yes, or at least there's more of an implied yes there, or there's some sort of ambiguity as to, yes, I think I do. Whereas in the movie, it's much more about his love for Lily. And even in the book, if it's not a direct, I don't love Harry like I did Lily, there is something about him that reminds him, despite how much he looks like his father, that still reminds him of Lily. And that is enough for Severus. And that ambiguity, I think, makes all the difference. And to me is incredible when you compound that with the sacrifice that he makes, the fact that he wanted no notoriety for it. He tells Dumbledore straight up, I do not want you to say this. I need you to promise me you will not tell anyone about this. Meaning that he had a role to play. All of that antagonism was there as an act. Maybe he didn't like the James and Harry. That probably was sincere and genuine.
Oh, for sure.
But all of that antagonism, while certainly sincere at times, was a role. He
Yeah.
was playing a role that was necessary for Harry's growth, for Harry's own, for his own growth to eventually find the strength to defeat Voldemort. And without it, he probably doesn't.
He gave
which
him an
is
obstacle, essentially. That's what it
absolutely.
was.
So like that reveal is so powerful, I think, and it gives so much more weight. As much as I still like it in the movie, especially because of Rickman, God bless him, R.I.P. But that ambiguity and that reveal, I think, is so powerful because then it gives even more weight to that moment between Harry and his son at the end when he calls him, or we get the reveal that Severus is part of his name. And we come to realize that Harry did recognize that bravery, that he did recognize the truth of who Snape was. It is so.
I don't mean to
so
laugh,
good.
but it's kind of adorable watching you right now.
It is so. I was undone.
I had a question to ask you, but now I
house.
think I know the answer to the question I was about to ask you. But keep going. Keep going.
I was emotionally gobsmacked by it. And I somewhat expected it because I love that in the movie. Like that's always been one of my favorite elements of Deathly Hallows. It's the best element of part 2 by far, as far as I'm concerned. You know, because it's always been fascinating, that dynamic, that relationship between Harry and Severus. And you get that moment in part 1 where this doe simply comes out of nowhere. And you're like, the first time you're watching this, you're like, what is going on here? Who sent the doe? Like,
but we're smart enough to know that that's going to be important later.
And even in the books, like there's a lot of conversation. Ron, a couple of times, is like, there was a doe that came out of nowhere. We don't know what happened. You know, and so like the film certainly builds that up, and then you get the reveal of not just who it was, but how that reveal comes about and why. As you know, with Severus and wanting to protect the family, wanting to protect Lily, and yes, it demonstrates his love for Lily. We certainly get that.
Yeah.
But that little change, at least from the movies to the books, that ambiguity, the idea that he did come to love Harry, and which makes sense given that throughout all of this, and he made in promising Dumbledore not to tell anyone. And I love how Dumbledore turns it on him like, okay, I won't tell anyone about the best of you.
Yeah. Yeah.
I like how he turns it on
in a very
him.
sarcastic way.
Very sarcastic way, turns it on back on Severus. But, you know, that was important to Severus. He didn't, he just wanted to have that role to play. And as a spy, it's necessary.
Yep.
I think both of them would have gotten to that conclusion regardless. And Severus played it
that is a
impeccably.
much better reveal than we got in The Rise of Skywalker, where someone just goes, "I'm the spy." Imagine if that's how Snape revealed it all.
No, yeah, I mean, just they do kind of reveal it a little bit in Order of the Phoenix, right? When Harry's on trial, and they talk about how Snape was a spy for Hogwarts and whatnot, but.
Yeah, but you take it with a certain grain of salt where you don't really directly imply it to Harry's journey, right?
Exactly. We don't know what that means yet.
Yeah.
And for it to come about that way, and to have this sleight of hand that he actually did care about Harry in some way, maybe surprisingly, that he did, and that it was his Patronus that eventually saved him.
Yeah.
When he needed it the most. In fact, we come to learn out that Severus had saved him many times over.
Yeah.
Throughout all of the books.
Looking.
Always on looking.
Yeah. So my question was going to be, and I think you answered it, is Deathly Hallows your favorite of the 7 books?
No, Azkaban is still my favorite.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, no, and it's funny because I've thought about this a lot. I know I think you mentioned this. It is so funny to me how Azkaban, the book and the movie, could not be more different, and yet I love them equally for
different reasons, though. But I often cite Prisoner of Azkaban, the movie, as the quote-unquote last Jedi of this franchise, because it does take its own liberties and kind of divided the fan base a little bit, at least those between the movie fans and the book fans. So it didn't do the exact same things that Rian Johnson did for the Star Wars trilogy, but it did create a certain form of contention between
Mhm.
fans. But I love that it took its own liberties, or Alfonso Cuarón took his own liberties
Yeah,
when making that one.
I agree. I mean, in the movies, I think Lupin is such a fascinating character. As much as I love him in the book, there is
Mhm.
something about those liberties that make him even more compelling to me in film form.
Yeah,
And and again, I think some of it is the performance, but it's just the craft
and
of it all. And
yeah, and it's also like trying to look at the books in general, because it sounds like the most emotional high you got from this series was from Deathly Hallows. But I do
Mhm.
remember, and again, this is 14-year-old Brendan or something like that reading these for the first time. I do remember thinking that Prisoner of Azkaban was the best written out of all of them. Like as
I
far as
love
its
it. No, I yeah,
yeah, like
I
just from
it's so
like from
good.
the
No,
perspective of
it's
dialogue, the way the plot is just as tight and seamless. I think I read that book as I was a kid. I was like in
mhm.
sixth or seventh grade. I think I read that in like 4 days or something.
Yeah,
I was like, yeah,
it's done in a different manner, but I still think Quran captures the spirit because that emotionality is still there in the book, and it's just
yeah,
done differently. But that's maybe indicative of J.K.'s talent and caliber in terms of her writing skills because she captures that emotion very well. Whereas the
yeah,
movie, I think the performance comes like it's the performance and the music that drives a lot of that
hmm,
emotion, as well as some of the dialogue and what's there on the page for sure. It's
yeah,
just done in
fair,
different ways, and that's what I love about the medium of the art forms. Quran realizes that this is a visual medium, so let's
hmm,
take advantage of that. And there's
yep,
music involved, so we got John Williams. We might as well let him capture one of the best themes he's ever done.
yep,
And also, we got some incredible talent here. So let's go ahead and get some of the best performances in this franchise.
hmm,
And I'm the director and I know what the hell I'm doing. So we're going to have some fun in the action and the storytelling. And so, like, from a visual perspective, from a cinematic perspective, Quran takes advantage of the art form. And same thing with JK as a novelist. Like, I think
yeah,
she does a great job in terms of her writing and capturing the emotion of that story in a very different way that works well for the book. I will, but yes, in terms of the books, the
hmm,
emotion of Deathly Hallows and Azkaban are by far the most emotionally
yeah,
gripping for me.
fair,
Um, Unless I love Order of the Phoenix, the book, but the emotion of that book is very different.
yeah,
That emotion is all about his anger and his bitterness and the sarcasm that burst out of him as a result,
hmm,
which I
yeah,
love. It is hilarious. So it's a different type of emotion.
hmm,
But in terms of poignancy and the somber qualities that come from Harry Potter, yeah, Azkaban and Deathly Hallows absolutely gobsmacked me. And I mean, I do know the other thing I love about Deathly Hallows, the book, and the film doesn't get into this as much. And again, I love the distinction, like the in terms of the art of adaptation throughout all of the movies. Harry and Dumbledore's relationship had been so tender
yeah,
and fatherly, and given Harry's circumstance, I think maintaining that all the way through made a lot of sense. And so I
agreed,
do love that they don't ever distract from that in film form. In Deathly Hallows, the book, there are a lot of moments where Harry questions Dumbledore. I don't
yeah,
know if I can trust him. Maybe he lied to me this whole time. This is way
hmm,
too ambiguous. I have no idea what
yeah,
I'm doing. Why didn't he just tell me what to do? Like
yeah.
there's a lot of Harry wrestling with that, which I appreciate. Like there's far
I'm
more
with you. I'm with
complexity
you.
there that from a book perspective I think is effective. I don't think that would have worked in film form.
No, no, that's so introspective. It's hard to convey that, even if you have the best actor working at it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm with you there.
So
Hey, you're
yeah, I
finally
mean,
done. You're finally done with
I'm all
these.
done. But yeah, the biggest reveal was Snape. I couldn't. I was destroyed, absolutely destroyed. And I just
Mhm.
and it's just funny because it's not often that you watch a movie and you have this antagonist, this so-called antagonist, at least dramatically he comes off as one, but really the truth of it is he's very selfless, he's brave, he is the hero that didn't want it. That didn't want to be publicized as one.
Right. Which
You know,
is arguably the most like selfless thing about him.
Yeah, he died alone, almost alone. He would have if Harry just didn't happen to be in the right place at the right time.
Oh yeah.
And no one, Hogwarts had turned against him. All of the staff, like nobody knew the truth. The only person that knew the truth was Dumbledore, and he was almost about to die, with the world thinking that he was
a bad
simply a
person.
Death Eater.
Yeah.
That's it. Like that, and the world we live in today, where everyone has an ego that is this high. Doesn't
that make you much stronger? Where you just let go of that ego? Like that's like a common thing. Like, just don't let your ego get in the way. And Snape never did.
And maybe the love that was like that ego was born out of love, and maybe that love was rooted or like maybe it was misguided.
Fair,
because it was for someone that was unattainable for him, but it was still born out of love, and out of that love, he came to care for another person that initially he probably didn't think that he would.
Right.
But he did.
Yep.
And I think it surprised him. In fact, this is just my interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think Snape realized that he cared about Harry until Dumbledore posed that question, because it's his immediate.
That's a good point.
His immediate response from Dumbledore posing that question isn't to answer it verbally.
Right.
It was to summon the Patronus.
Right.
The Patronus that eventually saved Harry's life. And
what do you do to summon a Patronus, right? You got to think of a happy thought, a good thought. You got
to think of a happy thought, exactly. And then he answered, always. I cannot begin to articulate what that did to me internally.
I mean, we all love Harry Potter. It makes us happy. I think we just got to think of Harry himself. We can develop our own Patronus, right?
And I was sitting there holding my son and uncontrollably sobbing. We all
know that your kids would be your happy thought when conducting your Patronus.
Yeah, at any rate. I think that'll do it for this Patreon session. We're done with Harry Potter for a while.
Yep, another long one.
Another long one. Thanks for listening, everybody. Enjoy episode 551.